I first noticed her the way you notice a small bird pressing against a storm, all feathers tight and determined. She was 14, a thin line of focus amid a hallway of restless feet and jangling water bottles. I worked the front desk at the studio and managed the audition sign-ins, so I saw the beginnings and endings most people miss. She wrote her name carefully each time, as if steadiness on the page might translate into steadiness on stage. Then she disappeared behind the mirrored door, where music rose like a wave that did not always carry everyone. The first rejection arrived quietly. She came out with shoulders rounded, holding the paper that said, "Not today." It was the look that stayed with me. Not anger, not even surprise, just that heavy stillness that settles when a dream skids on ice. She thanked me for the towel I offered, wiped her eyes, and said she would be back. Her voice was soft, but it had a core like a knot in wood. She returned, again and again. Each audition pushed against her like winter wind. Sometimes the music cut, and the room went bright and merciless. Sometimes the panel whispered, and her name drifted down the list without a check. I watched her fold the disappointments into herself, neat as a dancer folds warm-ups into a bag. She never made a scene. She tied her shoes tighter, and she stayed to practice in the small studio at the end of the hall. The one with a scuffed floor and a stubborn flicker in the ceiling light. On the nights when the building emptied and the echo of last steps faded, I could still hear her work, counts like a metronome in her breath, turns that started shaky and stopped with her foot scraping the floor, jumps that landed noisily and made the mirror tremble. If failure has a sound, it is not a shatter. It is a long sanding, rough at first, then finer with patience. She was sanding herself into shape. There were days when she feared she was only collecting no answers, as if the universe was a locked studio and she had the wrong key. I could see that fear in the way she stretched longer than needed, delaying the moment she faced the mirror. But she would finally stand center, lift her chin, and try again. Failure tugged at her like a heavy coat, and still she danced. I began to understand that perseverance is not a shout. It is a quiet, daily choice that reshapes a life grain by grain. When she left each night, the lobby smelled of dust and rosin. She would thank me on her way out and promise the next attempt would be better. I watched her step into the cold evening, a small figure stitched to the dark by the thread of her own resolve, and I found myself hoping that thread would hold. One evening, after yet another list went up without her name, the studio settled into the hush that follows a long day. I was closing the register when the older teacher, the one with silver in her bun and a posture that made silence feel orderly, paused outside the small practice room. She watched the girl repeat a turn until her body was a circle of effort, wobbling, resetting, trying again. The teacher stepped inside, with the steady calm of someone who understands the weight of beginnings. She moved like a tide coming in, quiet but undeniable. They did not speak loudly. I could see hands shaping the air, guiding an invisible frame around the girl's shoulders. The teacher adjusted a foot, lifted a ribcage with the slightest pressure, then let go so the girl could feel the difference on her own. It was not perfection she demanded, but presence. Own the beat, her hands seemed to say. Meet the floor as if it is a partner, not an audience. The girl nodded, cheeks flushed, eyes burning with the sting of being seen and the relief of being taught. What unfolded next felt like someone untying knots. The teacher gave her a simple assignment that felt like a small stone with a river's patience packed inside it. One combination, every day, until the body understood it better than the mind. Control the breath as if it is a soft rope you can coil. Finish the line of the arm even when no one watches. Fail in public without flinching, and fail in private without cruelty. She took these instructions the way thirsty soil takes rain, not in a rush. Deeply weeks turned on their quiet hinge. The girl arrived earlier, left later, and kept a notebook that lived in her bag like a private promise. I would catch snippets when she opened it by the desk to pay for extra studio time. Notes in firm strokes. What hurt, what landed, where the music felt like a friend, and where it felt like a cliff. The teacher would appear, sometimes with a metronome, sometimes with nothing but attention. She carried no magic beyond patience, no thunder beyond consistency, and somehow that was the thunder the girl needed. There were still bad days. I watched her unravel after a routine that would not settle, shoulders shaking as that old winter coat of doubt slid back on. The teacher stood with her through it, not to rescue, but to teach her the ceremony of beginning again. Reset the feet, count aloud, let the breath smooth the rough edges of the moment. Start where you are. Each restart was a match struck in a dark room, a small flare that said the lights could come back, even if only for a few heartbeats. Slowly, the room changed temperature around her. The mirror stopped being a judge and became a map. Mistakes turned from verdicts into arrows. I saw joy arrive in brief, honest flashes, not the glittering kind, but the sturdy sort that lodges behind the ribs and refuses to leave. Under that teacher's quiet orbit, the girl learned to translate failure into information. She learned to listen for the beat after the stumble. She learned that the body keeps its own forgiving calendar. When the heart shows up daily to mark the squares, years carried her forward, though not without their bruises. By the time she was 17, her body had memorized not just the movements, but the discipline that carved them. Each rejection that once felt like a closed gate now appeared as a mile marker. She no longer left auditions crushed, but curious. What angle was missing? Where did balance slip? Failure had become her second teacher, the one who spoke in silence and taught her the vocabulary of resilience. There were days the weight nearly won, long nights of aching joints, of blisters that burst inside worn shoes, of watching others leap ahead while she struggled to steady her turns. She still battled that voice that whispered she was destined only for almost. But perseverance had woven itself into her skin. Instead of retreating, she leaned harder into practice, arriving before sunrise to stretch in an empty studio where echoes of past failures seemed to soften into encouragement. When the long-awaited yes finally arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. She made a small, regional company, not the grand stage she once dreamed of, but a place where her effort had been seen and chosen. She danced, not flawlessly, but fully, and for the first time the applause felt like a language she could understand. Yet what defined her journey wasn't that single acceptance, but the years of shaping herself against resistance. In her 20s, the road bent again. She realized she wanted more than performance. She wanted to pass on what had saved her. She became a teacher, standing before young students whose wide eyes mirrored the same mixture of hope and fear she once carried. She saw herself in every trembling hand, every faltering step, and she remembered the nights she nearly quit. So she told them the truth, not that it would be easy, but that every no could be turned into a quiet yes, if they stayed long enough in the work. Her classes were not about perfection, but about persistence. She taught her students to embrace mistakes as part of the choreography of growth, to land heavily and rise again, to stretch past the point of comfort, not for applause, but for self-discovery. When they cried, she told them it was simply the body releasing what the heart could not yet say. When they succeeded, she reminded them to honor the road of stumbles that led there. Watching her, I understood the arc of her story more clearly. The girl who once walked into the cold night, with only determination to warm her, now stood radiant. Not because she had conquered failure, but because she had befriended it. Perseverance had turned her wounds into wisdom, her rejections into lessons, and her solitude into community. She had become proof that the hardest winters can bloom into the most generous springs. And those she taught would carry her lesson forward, that perseverance is the thread that turns failure into triumph, stitching broken moments into something enduring and whole. Sometimes we believe triumph is a destination, a single glowing moment of victory. But this story reminds us that triumph is stitched together from countless ordinary days when we refuse to quit. Perseverance is not loud, and it is rarely celebrated in the moment. It is quiet, steady, and unseen until one day it blooms into something undeniable. Her journey teaches us that failure is not the opposite of success, is the soil from which success grows. If this story touched you, take a moment to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience and hope, consider subscribing to Brighter Tomorrow. Every story is a reminder that even in the hardest seasons, we can choose to keep moving forward.